Today we're going to be focusing on my car and why I want to go to Bonneville. When I say my car, it's not just a car that I own, it's a car that I've built. And it's been built mostly from components that have been cast from our patterns or machined, fabricated in-house. We started investing in equipment to produce bits of Bugatti 40 years ago with my dad, and I've kept it up for the last 20 years. Some of the equipment could be quite simple, such as the pattern work required to produce a gearbox top to carry a starter motor, and some of it can be quite complicated, such as the forging dies that you need to produce original style hollow front axles, which are forged straight, bent, then machined and finally polished. So is it a Bugatti? I think it is. I see it as a piece of conceptual art with Bugatti as the artist. The real value is in the concept, not in the execution, however competent that might be. So if you stick to the original Bugatti drawings, you've got a Bugatti. So why Bonneville? One of my earliest motoring memories is sitting in the back of the old man's Escort Sport, hanging onto the roll cage while we went down the A40, getting to the place where, just after the M25 is now, it straightens out before Beaconsfield. He'd then hold the car absolutely flat out as fast as it would go to see if it had gained a few RPM from the idea that he'd put into practice in tuning the car. VMAX. This is in the time before cameras, of course, and the roads were empty. Nowadays it would be impossible, in the Orwellian nightmare we seem to have found ourselves in. So when I then got interested in building cars and building racing cars and stopped reading 2000 AD, I started reading books like Phil Irvin's Tuning for Speed, and also magazines, American hot rod magazines mostly. They seem to have a lot of technical information in them, and one I remember vividly had a picture on the cover of the Mayer Drake short stroke turbocharged Offenhauser engine. I'm sure in that magazine was the first time I came across the black and gold number 13 Chevy that Smokey Yunick had built. Smokey Yunick would later become quite a hero of mine as I got to know more about him, his lateral thinking, reverse rotation engines, 2-gallon fuel lines, that kind of thing. Then there was Carroll Smith. Carroll Smith books taught me about materials, fasteners, the right way to build cars, a way that wouldn't get people killed. And I also found out about Frank Lockhart. Frank Lockhart was a racing driver and mechanic in America who fitted intercoolers to the side of Miller engines. He ran the engines at night on the dyno with stub pipes so he could watch the flames coming out of the side of the engine and decide how to change the intercooler to even the charge across all of the 8 cylinders. For me, that's mechanicking at its best. Later, we got involved with records at Millbrook, which is a bowl just outside of Luton. It's a 100-mile-an-hour banked circuit, which means at the top of the bowl, if you take your hands off the wheel 100 miles an hour, it'll run round. There we found out that our 200 brake horsepower Type 35B would do 142 miles an hour. With that in mind, if my car makes 30% more power, which I hope it will, it should be able to go about 10% faster as drag increases with velocity cubed. I see Bonneville as a 3-year process, the first year going with a car that is essentially standard. This means it'll be fairly reliable and I'll get a chance to learn about Bonneville and running on salt. Also, next year I'll be able to run the car at Prescott and do some race meetings with it. It's going to be slightly different because it's going to have an outside exhaust pipe like a Type 59. Some Type 51s in period had that kind of exhaust system. I've seen them on original cars. It's also going to have a Scintilla Vertex ignition system. You need a good spark when you're running on methanol. At peak demand, we're going to be looking at something like a gallon a minute, delivered from the fuel tank under pressure in the original manner. Regulations, it's going to have a roll cage or roll hoop. The rear wheel back plates have been modified to stop the wheels coming off should the half shaft break. All of the brakes and steering are split pinned and wired. Carol Smith used to say if it's tight it won't come undone, if it's wired it can't. The steering links have been correctly assembled. Bugatti steering links work without the spring if you put them together properly, and they won't come off. But if you put them together wrong, they will. The standard Brooklands scrutineering test was to stand on the steering link and jump a little bit, and if the link didn't come off it was correctly assembled. If it did, it wasn't. The steering column is assembled using taper pins. You can see they're wired and split pinned. The reason for this is they have been known for the threaded portion to break off and then the pin comes out, which is obviously a problem. So by doing this, if it should break, the wire should retain it long enough to get you safely to a stop. But also, if it does break, rather than wiring all the way around the pin, which would hold the nut in place so you wouldn't know it was broken, the nut will fall off and you can see it was broken. Steering wheel's quite a nice bit. It's a rubberized wheel that I think came from America. Better to be rubber than wood, because should you have an accident in a car with wood, when the wood breaks it goes into your hand. It's also mounted on a early quick release hub which had come off of a Type 59. So you undo the nut, pull the wheel off, makes it a lot easier to get down into the clutch area to work on the clutch. Dashboard is mostly new gauges which were supplied by John Marks Vintage Restoration. The hand air pump I've moved into a position that you see on some Type 59s, which makes it a lot easier to pump. For the regs, it's got to have a catch tank, and that's what I was making over the last couple of days. And there are two tanks on the bulkhead. The right hand tank is for petrol. Cars running on methanol can be quite difficult to start, especially in cold weather. So by using petrol and injecting that using the Kai gas into the top of the manifold, it'll start on the petrol, allowing it to then run on the methanol that's in the carburettor. As I say, use the Kai gas pump, which is on the dash. The clutch is a standard Bugatti toggle clutch, which uses a certain amount of centrifugal force to bring it in. It makes for a very light pedal action, even though the clutch is more than capable of holding 250 or 270 horsepower, especially if you use the ceramic metallic discs with the square centres that work with the original clutch shaft. The gearbox is an absolutely standard Bugatti crash gearbox, but it's the best gearbox you'll ever drive. It changes gear as fast as you can move your hand. It is unbelievably good. Radiator, Type 51 radiator that came from Star Engineering. Front axle's one of our front axles. And then to the engine. The engine, as I say, is essentially standard. I've changed the cam timing slightly to increase the power and torque. The cylinder block is one of our cylinder blocks. The biggest change we've made to it is we've reduced the size of the inlet and exhaust ports. This increases the gas velocity and also allows us to put a certain amount of D-shape in the critical turn in the port, which equalises the velocity across the port and improves the flow. The other thing that we've changed on this block is we've fitted 10mm spark plugs. The main reason for using 10mm spark plugs is that we just can't get the heat ranges in 18 and 14mm plugs anymore, whereas 10mm plugs are where all the development is at the moment. For carburettors, I'll be using 48K Zenith for Prescott, but for the record run, I'll be fitting the big SU carburettor. Supercharger drive is a 1.47 drive. The original blower drives from the factory were 1:1, and then the standard overdriven blower drive was 1.2:1. The Roots blower, there's a bit of a law of diminishing returns when you start running it faster. So although I've got a Vartsy case, which means I can probably run ratios up to about 3:1, I might have to change to a vane blower in order to be able to use it to make more horsepower and make the car go faster. In terms of axle ratio, the Blockley tyres I'm using, which Julian assures me are safe to over 200 miles an hour, would give a top speed of 151 miles an hour at 6,000 revs with the highest Bugatti axle ratio of 1554 or 3.6 to 1. In order to do 170 miles an hour, I'd have to change that to a 3.2 to 1. So that's this week's instalment of Tim's World. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm not sure what I'm going to do next time. Send me some comments, ask me some questions, I'll see what I can do.